Starmer's asylum hotel crisis, the Epping explosion that changes everything. Right, let's get straight to business, because what I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change how you view Keir Starmer's handling of the asylum crisis. But first, if you're serious about understanding what's really happening in British politics, hit that subscribe button now. Trust me, after what you're about to hear, you'll want to be part of this conversation every single week. The Bell Hotel in Epping has just become the epicenter of a legal and political earthquake that exposes everything wrong with Labour's approach to the asylum crisis. What happened there isn't just another local dispute. It's a defining moment that reveals a complete hollowness of Starmer's promises and the utter chaos of his government's immigration policy. And here's the kicker. Starmer himself warned about exactly the situation, yet when push came to shove, his government fought tooth and nail to make it happen anyway. Let me take you through what actually occurred at the Court of Appeal, because the media coverage has been woefully inadequate in explaining the significance of this decision. The court overturned an injunction that would have prevented the Bell Hotel from being used to house asylum seekers, and their reasoning should send chills down the spine of every community leader across Britain. The judges didn't rule on the merits of housing asylum seekers in inappropriate locations. They ruled that preventing it would interfere too much with the government's obligations and might encourage other councils to seek similar protection for their communities. Think about that for a moment. The Court of Appeal essentially said that protecting local communities from inappropriate asylum accommodation is less important than protecting the government's right to dump people wherever it's most convenient. This isn't justice. This is judicial activism in service of administrative convenience, and it sets a precedent that will haunt communities across Britain for years to come. But here's where this story becomes absolutely extraordinary, and if you're not already subscribed, you really need to be, because this analysis is about to get explosive. Who was one of the most vocal critics of using hotels to house asylum seekers? None other than Sir Keir Starmer himself, back when he was leader of the opposition. He repeatedly warned that hotel accommodation was unsuitable, unsustainable, and unfair to both asylum seekers and local communities. He promised that Labour would end this practice and implement a proper, managed system. So what happened when his government had the chance to support Epping Forest District Council's perfectly reasonable attempt to prevent an inappropriate hotel placement? They fought it all the way to the Court of Appeal and celebrated when they won. This isn't just political hypocrisy. This is a masterclass in saying one thing in opposition and doing the exact opposite in government. It's the kind of cynical flip-flopping that destroys public trust in the entire political system. Lord Falconer, one of Labour's more experienced voices, has at least had the decency to acknowledge that his party needs to take decisive action on the asylum hotel crisis. His push for stronger measures and emphasized the necessity of actually closing the facilities rather than just talking about it. But here's the problem. Falconer's calls for action are being completely ignored by the very government he's supposed to support. His own party is doing precisely the opposite of what he's recommending, and the silence from Downing Street is deafening. Now, if you're finding this as infuriating as I am, make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to dive into the numbers that will shock you. By the end of June, more than 32,000 asylum seekers were housed in hotels across the United Kingdom. 32,000. That's not a temporary emergency measure. That's a parallel accommodation system that's costing taxpayers billions while providing substandard conditions for the people it's supposed to help. But the real scandal isn't just the numbers. It's a complete absence of any coherent strategy for addressing this crisis. The government's only response to community concerns is to lawyer up and fight local councils in court. They are spending more money on legal fees to force unwanted asylum hotels on communities than they would spend on finding appropriate alternatives. This isn't governance. This is bureaucratic bullying backed by expensive barristers. The protesters in Epping have pledged to continue their demonstrations, and frankly, who can blame them? They followed all the proper legal procedures, won an injunction based on legitimate concerns, and then watched as the government used the full weight of the legal system to override their community's interests. These aren't racist protesters or far-right agitators. These are ordinary residents who've been completely let down by a system that claims to represent their interests while actively working against them. Here's what makes this situation even more galling, and if you're getting as wound up about this as I am, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. The Court of Appeal's decision wasn't based on evidence that the Bell Hotel was suitable for asylum accommodation. It wasn't based on any assessment of the impact on local services or community cohesion. It was based purely on the argument that stopping it might encourage other communities to seek similar protections. In other words, the court ruled that the government convenience trumps community consent every single time. This precedent is absolutely toxic for local democracy. What's the point of having elected local councils if central government can override their decisions whenever it's administratively convenient? What's the point of planning laws, local consultation, or community input if a judge can simply declare that government obligations supersede all other considerations? We're watching the systematic dismantling of local democracy in real time, and it's being done by a Labour government that once claimed to believe in community empowerment. The Supreme Court is now reviewing an appeal from Epping Forest District Council, and this case could determine the future of community rights across Britain. If the Supreme Court upholds the appeal court's decision, it will effectively give government departments carte blanche to impose whatever facilities they want on whatever communities they choose, regardless of local objections or unsuitable conditions. That's not the kind of democracy most. But let's talk about the broader implications of this case, because what's happening in Epping is symptomatic of everything that's wrong with Labour's approach to immigration policy. Make sure you're subscribed because this analysis is about to reveal some uncomfortable truths about how this government really operates. They came into power promising competence, consultation, and community-focused governance. Instead, we're seeing authoritarian overreach, legal intimidation, and complete disregard for local democratic processes. The 32,000 asylum seekers in hotels aren't there because it's the best solution for them. They're there because it's the easiest solution for civil servants who can't be bothered to develop proper accommodation strategies. These hotels are often completely inappropriate for long-term residents, lacking proper cooking facilities, privacy, or space for families. The conditions are frequently substandard, and the isolation from normal community life makes integration almost impossible. Yet instead of acknowledging these problems and working to address them, the government's response is to fight any community that dares to object. They are treating legitimate community concerns as obstacles to be overcome rather than voices to be heard. This isn't just bad policy, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how democracy is supposed to work in a free society. Here's what really gets me about this whole situation, and if you're not subscribed yet, you absolutely should be because this is a kind of analysis you won't get anywhere else. Starmer and his team spent years in opposition criticizing conservatives for exactly this kind of high-handed approach to asylum accommodation. They said it was chaotic, expensive, and unfair. They promised a better way. But when they got the chance to implement that better way, what did they do? They doubled down on the worst aspect of the conservative approach while adding their own layer of legal aggression against concerned communities. The protesters in Epping have every right to be furious, and their commitment to continuing their demonstrations shows that this isn't just a passing issue that will fade from public attention. These are people who believed in the democratic process, followed the proper procedures, and then discovered that their own government was working actively against their interests. That kind of betrayal doesn't fade quickly, and it doesn't build confidence in the political system. What's particularly insidious about the Court of Appeal's reasoning is how it essentially criminalizes community self-defense. By ruling that preventing inappropriate asylum accommodation might encourage other communities to seek similar protections, they are treating community rights as a contagious disease that must be stamped out before it spreads. This isn't jurisprudence. It's social engineering designed to prevent communities from protecting their own interests. The government's celebration of this court victory reveals everything you need to know about their priorities. They are not celebrating because they found a better solution for asylum seekers. They are celebrating because they've eliminated a potential obstacle to their administrative convenience. The people housed in these hotels are still in unsuitable accommodation. The communities affected still have legitimate concerns, and the underlying problems remain completely unaddressed. But the government has protected its right to ignore all of these issues, and apparently that's what counts as success in Starmer's Britain. If you're following this story and want to stay informed about how it develops, make sure you're subscribed to UK Connors because the Supreme Court case is going to be absolutely crucial. The decision they make could either restore some balance to the relationship between central government and local communities, or it could cement the precedent that government convenience always trumps community consent. Either way, it's going to have implications far beyond asylum policy. But here's what makes this story even more significant in the broader context of Labour's governance. The Epping case isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern of authoritarian overreach that's becoming increasingly obvious across multiple policy areas. Whether it's planning decisions, environmental regulations, or immigration policy, This government's default response to local objections is to lawyer up and fight rather than listen and negotiate. That's not the mature, consultative governance they promised. It's the kind of heavy-handed centralization that would make Tony Blair blush. The human cost of this approach is enormous and largely ignored by the mainstream media. The asylum seekers in these hotels aren't getting the support they need to rebuild their lives and integrate into British society. The communities hosting these facilities aren't getting the resources or consultation they need to manage the impact. And the taxpayers funding this entire system aren't getting value for money or effective outcomes. Everyone loses except the civil servants who get to avoid making difficult decisions about proper accommodation strategies. What's most damaging about the government's approach is how it's poisoning the well for any future immigration policy. By riding roughshod over community concerns and dismissing legitimate objections as obstacles to be overcome, they're creating the kind of resentment and mistrust that makes sensible immigration policy almost impossible. Communities that might have been willing to work constructively on accommodation solutions are now approaching the entire issue from a defensive posture, expecting to be ignored and overruled regardless of what they contribute to the discussion. The Epping case is also revealing about how Labour views a relationship between government and citizens. Their actions suggest they believe communities exist to serve government policy rather than government existing to serve community interests. When local residents raise concerns about inappropriate asylum accommodation, the government's response isn't to address those concerns or find better solutions. It's to eliminate the legal mechanisms that allow communities to raise objections in the first place. That's not democratic governance. That's administrative authoritarianism with a democratic veneer. Here's the really concerning part about where this is all heading, and make sure you're subscribed because this analysis is going to become increasingly important as more communities find themselves in Epping's position. The Court of Appeal's decision creates a legal framework that essentially gives government departments unlimited power to impose their policy preferences on unwilling communities. If you can override local objection by arguing that preventing your preferred policy might encourage other areas to seek similar protection, then community consent becomes beyond asylum policy. Planning applications that serve government priorities will be harder to challenge. Environmental projects that impose costs on local communities will be easier to force through. Infrastructure decisions that benefit central government politically will be insulated from local democratic input. The Epping decision isn't just about one hotel. It's about the fundamental balance of power between central government and local democracy, and that balance has just shifted dramatically in favor of centralized authority. The protesters who pledged to continue their demonstrations understand this broader significance, even if the media coverage doesn't. They are not just fighting about one asylum hotel. They are fighting for the principle that communities should have meaningful input into decisions that affect their daily lives. That's a principle worth defending, regardless of your views on immigration policy, because once it's lost, it's extraordinarily difficult to recover. So where does this leave us as we await the Supreme Court decision? And watch how this crisis continues to unfold. If you want to stay ahead of these developments, you need to be subscribed to UK Connors because this story is far from over. The implications of the Epping case will ripple through British politics for years to come, affecting not just asylum policy, but the entire relationship between government and governed. This is a kind of fundamental constitutional issue that reshapes how democracy works in practice, and you won't want to miss how it develops. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with anyone who cares about community rights and democratic governance, and prepare for what could be one of the most important Supreme Court cases in recent British history.